Deep in the Appalachian mountains, imagine a fog-shrouded hollow where the wind carries whispers of forgotten sins. You've just pulled off a crumbling West Virginia road. Your tires crunch over gravel when you spot it. An isolated cluster of shacks, their windows like empty eyes, staring back. Inside, shadows move, figures twisted by time and blood. Among them is a child, no more than 12, her belly swollen with a secret that binds the family tighter than chains. This is no ghost story. It is real, etched into the genealogy of the Whitaker family, America's most haunted bloodline, a legacy of inbreeding so profound it warps minds and bodies, hiding truths that society buried long ago. Dare to look closer, and you will see the darkness lurking in the roots of our nation's hidden history. Hello everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. This way, YouTube will keep showing you stories, just like this one, in West Virginia's shadowed valleys, where coal mines scar the earth like old wounds. The Whitaker family story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet union of blood that should never have mixed. It all traces back to the late 19th century, when identical twin brothers Henry and John Whitaker were born into a world of hardship and isolation. These men, mirror images of each other, grew up in the rural backwoods where survival meant clinging to families, sometimes too closely. Henry married a local woman named Sally, and together they raised a son named John Emery. Meanwhile, his twin John wed a woman, and they brought forth a daughter, Gracie Irene. In any other tale, this might have been the end of its simple branches on a family tree, but fate, or perhaps desperation, twisted their paths. The twins' children, John, Emery, and Gracie, were double first cousins, sharing not just blood, but an eerie genetic echo from their identical fathers. In 1937, they married, sealing a bond that blurred the lines between love and taboo. Their union produced 15 children, each one a living testament to the perils of inbreeding. The first, Eileen, arrived healthy enough, but as the brood grew, the shadows lengthened. Their second, Emery Lee, gasped his last breath from pneumonia just a month after birth, a fragile life snuffed out too soon. Then came Freddie, who would later succumb to a long illness, his body ravaged by unseen defects. Lorene, one of the daughters, gave birth to Timmy in 1979, a boy whose mind would forever wander in simplicity. But whispers in the hollows spoke of darker currents beneath this surface. Isolation bred not just genetic frailties, but secrets that festered like untreated wounds. The family huddled in Odd, an aptly named village, where outsiders were rare and suspicions ran deep. John and Gracie's home became a fortress of silence, where the children's eyes held stories they couldn't voice. And amid this tangled web, allegations surfaced, hints of violations within the bloodline, where youth was stolen in the name of continuity. One account, buried in court records and hushed testimonies, points to a girl scarcely into her teens, bearing the burden of a pregnancy that shocked even the most jaded investigators. She was 12, they say, when the cycle repeated itself, a child forced into motherhood by the very ties that should have protected her. This was no mere rumor. It echoed through the convictions of later generations, where grandsons like John Wade Jr. and Jason faced justice for assaults on the innocent. Preying on girls as young as 13, the Whitaker bloodline, once a simple thread, had knotted into something monstrous. Genetic mutations manifested in fused eyelids, cleft palates, and minds trapped in eternal childhood. Ray, one of the brothers, communicates only in grunts and barks, his face a map of unspoken pain. Betty, the matriarch now, vowed never to marry, dedicating her life to shielding her siblings from the world's gaze. Yet the past clings like mountain mist, refusing to dissipate. In Odd, time moves differently, with cycles of birth and decay repeating. Each generation pays the price for ancestors' choices. As historians sift through faded documents, they uncover a pattern: poverty driving families inward, where marriage outside the clan meant risking the unknown. But for the Whitakers, the cost was higher: lives stunted, potentials crushed under the weight of inherited flaws. Peeling back these layers reveals not just a family, but a microcosm of America's forgotten underbelly. The Appalachians hold many such tales, but none as viscerally unsettling as this. What drove Henry and John to let their bloodlines entwine so fatally? Was it ignorance, or a deeper primal urge to preserve purity at any cost? The answers lie buried in unmarked graves and sealed records, waiting for those brave enough to dig. And as we delve deeper, remember this isn't ancient history. The Whitakers live on. Their story, a living cautionary tale, echoing through the hills, like a warning from the past. The Whitaker family story doesn't end with John and Gracie's generation. It spirals further into the shadows, each child a new chapter in a book no one dared to read aloud. By the 1960s, their home in Odd, West Virginia, was more than a dwelling. It was a crucible where isolation and inbreeding forged lives, marked by struggle and secrecy. The children, 15 in total, grew up in a world apart, where the outside was a distant rumor and family was everything. But this closeness came at a cost. Medical records, scarce and often incomplete, hinted congenital issues that plagued the brood: heart defects, skeletal anomalies, and intellectual disabilities wove through their lineage like threads in a cursed tapestry. Betty, the eldest surviving daughter, became the family's anchor, her fierce loyalty a shield against prying eyes. Yet even she couldn't protect them from the whispers of what happened behind closed doors. Among the siblings, Lorene stood out, not for her strength, but for her tragedy. At 18, she gave birth to Timmy, a boy whose developmental delays were evident early on. Whispers in Odd suggested his father was no stranger to the family, a claim that carried the weight of taboo. Lorene's life, like her mother's before her, was shaped by the expectations of a clan that turned inward to survive. But survival meant sacrifice. The children grew up in a haze of poverty, their world limited to the hollows and the creaking walls of their shacks. Education was a luxury replaced by the daily grind of existence. Some, like Ray and Larry, bore the physical marks of their heritage, faces that seemed to carry the weight of generations, eyes that saw too much yet understood too little. The community around them played a role in this seclusion. Odd was a place where secrets were currency, and the Whitakers were both pitied and feared. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the family, about children born too young, about pregnancies that raised questions no one dared answer. Court documents from the 1980s reveal a disturbing pattern: allegations of incest and abuse, not just within the Whitaker home, but radiating outward. One case involved a granddaughter, barely a teenager, whose pregnancy sent shockwaves through the county. The father, a relative, was convicted, but the damage was done. A child, raising a child, her future stolen before it began. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a cycle that thrived in isolation, where shame silenced truth. What makes this tale so chilling is its persistence. The Whitakers didn't vanish into history. They endured, their bloodline a living paradox of resilience and ruin. Geneticists who've studied such cases point to inbreeding's brutal arithmetic. Each generation doubles the risk of recessive disorders, amplifying flaws until they scream through flesh and bone. For the Whitakers, this meant children who could barely speak, siblings whose lives were tethered to a family that both loved and destroyed them. The hills of West Virginia, with their beauty and brutality, became a prison of circumstance. And yet the family pressed on, their story a dark mirror, reflecting America's hidden corners, places where poverty and pride conspire to bury the truth. As we peel back another layer, the question lingers: how deep does this darkness run? And what does it say about the nation that let it fester? By the 1980s, The Whitaker family saga had become a living ghost story, one that locals in odd West Virginia whispered about but rarely confronted. The family's shacks, clustered like gravestones in the hollow, stood as silent witnesses to decades of intertwined bloodlines. The children of John and Gracie, now adults, carried the scars of their heritage, some in their bodies, others in their minds. Ray, with his grunts and wild gestures, seemed to embody the family's unspoken pain, his voice trapped in a place words couldn't reach. Lorraine, another sibling, bore the weight of her own tragedies, her eyes reflecting a life of quiet endurance. The family's isolation wasn't just physical. It was a wall built from shame, poverty, and a stubborn refusal to let the outside world in. But the outside world was beginning to notice. Social workers and county officials, drawn by rumors of neglect and abuse, started circling closer. Reports from the era, buried in dusty archives, describe a household where chaos reigned. Children born to the Whitaker daughters often stayed within the clan, raised in a haze of confusion about who was parent, sibling, or cousin. One case, documented in a 1984 court filing, tells of a girl barely 12, pregnant by a relative, her name redacted to shield her from a world that had already failed her. The father, a Whitaker cousin, faced charges, but convictions did little to unravel the family's knotted ties. These weren't anomalies. They were patterns woven into the fabric of a bloodline that had turned inward for too long. The genetic toll was undeniable. Doctors who examined the family noted conditions like microcephaly and severe developmental delays, traits that appeared with chilling frequency. Each child born to the Whitakers carried a higher risk of inheriting recessive disorders. Their DNA, a ticking time bomb of ancestral choices. Yet the family's loyalty to one another was fierce, almost primal. Betty, now the de facto matriarch, guarded her siblings like a sentinel, deflecting questions from outsiders with a steely gaze. She knew the world saw them as freaks, a curiosity to be gawked at, but to her, they were family flawed, broken, but hers. This loyalty, though, couldn't shield them from the truth. Their bloodline was a labyrinth, with no exit. What's most haunting is how this story mirrors America's hidden fractures. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were a symptom of a nation that often ignores its most vulnerable. Rural poverty, lack of education, and systemic neglect created the conditions for this tragedy to unfold. The hills of West Virginia, with their beauty and desolation, became a crucible where the worst of human instincts could fester unchecked. As we dig deeper, the question isn't just about the Whitakers. It's about what their story reveals about the shadows we all inherit, the ones we pretend don't exist. By the 1990s, the Whitaker family story had taken on a mythic quality, an odd West Virginia tale told in hushed tones around campfires and in bars. The family's shacks, weathered by time and neglect, stood as relics of a past that refused to stay buried. The surviving siblings, Betty, Lorraine, Ray, and others lived in a world that had grown smaller, tighter, as if the hills themselves were closing in. Their lives were a paradox, bound by love, yet fractured by the consequences of their bloodline. The outside world, now more connected than ever, began to cast a harsher light on their existence. Documentarians and curious journalists ventured into the hollow, drawn by rumors of a family unlike any other, their cameras capturing faces that told stories of both resilience and ruin. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Whitaker children, now adults, were a living gallery of inbreeding's toll. Timmy, Lorraine's son, moved through life with a childlike simplicity, his speech halting and his understanding limited. Ray, unable to form words, communicated through guttural sounds, his eyes wild with emotions he couldn't express. Medical evaluations, though rare, painted a grim picture. Congenital heart issues, skeletal deformities, and cognitive impairments that left some siblings dependent on Betty's care. The family's isolation had preserved them in a way, but it also trapped them in a cycle of dependency and dysfunction. Social services, underfunded and overwhelmed, made sporadic visits, but interventions were fleeting. The Whitakers were too entrenched, their way of life too deeply rooted to be easily untangled. What chilled investigators most was the persistence of the family's darker secrets. Court records from the decade reveal more allegations of abuse, with names like John Wade Jr. and Jason Whitaker appearing in charges of sexual assault against minors. One case, buried in a 1992 docket, described a girl just 13, pregnant by a family member. Her identity shielded, but her trauma laid bare in clinical prose. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the inevitable fruit of a bloodline that had collapsed inward, where boundaries of kinship blurred into something grotesque. The community, complicit in its silence, turned away, leaving the Whitakers to their fate. Yet there was humanity here, too, in the way Betty held her family together, in the fleeting moments of laughter captured by outsiders' lenses. The Whitakers weren't monsters. They were people caught in a web spun by poverty, ignorance, and a history that offered no escape. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's margins, places where help rarely reaches, where cycles of trauma perpetuate themselves in silence. As we peel back this layer, the question isn't just about the Whitakers' sins. It's about the society that let them fester, watching from a distance, as a family drowned in its own blood. As the new millennium dawned, the Whitaker family story began to spill beyond the confines of odd West Virginia, carried by the internet's unblinking eye. Their shacks, now crumbling under the weight of decades, became a grim pilgrimage site for those drawn to the macabre. YouTube videos and amateur documentaries spread their tale, framing them as both victims and curiosities. Betty, now in her later years, remained the family's stoic guardian, her weathered face a mask hiding a lifetime of burdens. Her siblings, Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and others lived in a world that felt frozen in time, their daily routines unchanged even as the world's gaze sharpened. The Whitakers had become a symbol not just of inbreeding's horrors, but of a nation's failure to confront its own shadows. The genetic consequences were now undeniable, etched into the very bodies of the family. Siblings like Larry, with his fused eyelids, and Ray, with his wordless cries, were living proof of what happens when bloodlines loop too tightly. Geneticists studying cases like the Whitakers describe a phenomenon called inbreeding depression, where recessive genes pile up, manifesting as physical and mental frailties. The family's medical records, though patchy, note conditions like epilepsy and severe developmental delays, some so profound that basic communication was a struggle. Yet, in rare moments captured by outsiders, there was a flicker of joy, a shared cigarette, a laugh over a shared memory that reminded the world these were people, not just a case study. The darker truths, though, refused to stay buried. Whispers of abuse persisted, with allegations surfacing as late as the 2000s. One chilling account, tucked away in a local newspaper archive, spoke of a young Whitaker girl barely into her teens, pregnant under circumstances that pointed to a relative. The case echoed earlier tragedies, a grim reminder that the family's isolation didn't just preserve their bloodline, it enabled cycles of harm. Legal interventions came and went, but the Whitakers' insularity made change nearly impossible. Betty's fierce protectiveness, while admirable, often shielded the guilty as much as the innocent, perpetuating a legacy of silence. This story's power lies in its ability to unsettle, to force us to look at the edges of society where help rarely reaches. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were a warning, a mirror reflecting the cost of neglect, poverty, and ignorance. Their lives, shaped by choices made generations ago, ask us to consider what we owe those trapped in cycles, not of their making. As we near the end of this tale, the question looms, can a bloodline so broken ever find redemption? Or is it doomed to echo its own tragedies forever? The Whitaker family story, as it stands today, is a haunting echo that refuses to fade, carried forward by the few who remain in Odd, West Virginia. The shacks, now barely standing, are like the bones of a past that clings to the present. Betty, the unwavering matriarch, has grown frail, her life spent holding together a family fractured by its own blood. Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, among the last of their generation, live in a world that's both timeless and trapped, surrounded by the same hills that cradled their ancestors' sins. The internet has made them infamous, their faces splashed across screens, dissected by strangers who see them as a spectacle rather than a tragedy. Yet in their daily lives, there's a quiet defiance, a refusal to be defined solely by their pain. The genetic legacy of the Whitakers is a textbook case of inbreeding's long shadow. Scientists point to their story as a stark illustration of how isolated communities, cut off from resources, can spiral into biological ruin. Conditions like congenital heart defects, cleft palates, and profound developmental delays aren't just medical notes. They're the visible scars of a bloodline that looped too tightly for too long. The family's isolation, once a shield against a judgmental world, became a prison, locking them into cycles of poverty and dysfunction. And yet, there's a flicker of humanity that endures moments of tenderness, like Betty's fierce care for her siblings, or Timmy's childlike smile, that remind us these are people, not just a cautionary tale. The darker threads of their story, allegations of abuse, of children born, 2 children persist in the collective memory of Odd. Court records, though sparse, hint at incidents as recent as the 2010s, where the family's insularity allowed harm to fester unchecked. These aren't just stories of the past. They are wounds that never fully healed, passed down like a cursed inheritance no one wanted. The community, complicit in its silence, shares the blame, as does a society that left rural Appalachia to fend for itself. The Whitaker's tale forces us to ask, how many other families, hidden in America's forgotten corners, are trapped in similar cycles, unseen and unaided? This story doesn't end with answers, but with questions that linger like mist in the hollows. What does it mean to be human when your bloodline betrays you? What does it say about a nation that lets its tunnels of despair widen generation after generation? The Whitakers, living relics of a buried truth, challenge us to confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. Their story, raw and unsettling, is a mirror held up to America's past, a past that still whispers in the hills of West Virginia, waiting for those brave enough to listen. You've journeyed with us through the Whitaker family's haunting tale, peeling back layers of a bloodline twisted by time and circumstance. Their story, buried in the hollows of Odd, West Virginia, isn't just a family's tragedy. It's a mirror to America's forgotten corners, where poverty and isolation breed secrets too heavy to carry. The shacks still stand, crumbling sentinels of a past that clings to the present, whispering of children born too soon, of lives warped by choices made generations ago. Betty's unwavering loyalty, Ray's wordless cries, and the chilling accounts of girls as young as 12, bearing the weight of their kin's sins. These are the threads of a tapestry no one was meant to see. This isn't a story that ends neatly, tied up with answers or redemption. The Whitakers live on, their lives a quiet defiance against a world that both shuns and exploits them. Their bloodline, scarred by inbreeding, carries the weight of congenital defects, heart issues, cleft palates, minds locked in eternal childhood. Yet in their laughter, their shared moments of tenderness, there's a humanity that refuses to be erased. The allegations of abuse, documented through decades in court records, point to a darker truth. Isolation doesn't just preserve, it destroys, enabling cycles of harm that no one fully stopped. The girl pregnant at 12 wasn't just a victim of her family. She was a casualty of a society that looked away. What does this tale ask of us? To confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. to question what we owe those trapped in cycles of despair. The Whitakers aren't just a family. They're a warning etched in flesh and bone, a reminder that neglect festers where help doesn't reach. Appalachia's hills hold countless stories like theirs, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. As you leave this story, carry its weight with you. Ask yourself what happens when a nation forgets its own. What other truths lie buried, waiting to be unearthed? Before you go, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment. Tell us what this tale stirred in you and where you're watching from. The Whitaker family's echoes linger, and so do the questions they leave behind. Until next time, keep searching for the truths hidden in the shadows. The echoes of the Whitaker bloodline do not simply fade. They ripple outward, touching the lives of those who, by chance or choice, intersect with their world. Consider the social workers, the few who ventured into the hollow with files and good intentions. They arrived in clean sedans, their presence announced by the crunch of gravel that sent a temporary hush over the property. They would speak with Betty on the porch, her arms crossed, a silent wall of defiance. They saw the conditions, the peeling paint, the makeshift repairs, the faces that peered from behind curtains. They filed their reports, documented the deplorable living situation and the concerning dependency among adults. But the system, stretched thin and ill-equipped for such profound, generational entanglement, could only offer temporary solutions: a food voucher, a referral from medical care that was too far away to access, a well-meaning but futile parenting class. The workers would leave, their tires kicking up the same gravel, and life in the hollow would settle back into its entrenched patterns. The family's resilience outlasting the bureaucracy's fleeting attention. Then there are the outsiders drawn by the legend, YouTubers and urbex explorers, armed with cameras and a hunger for the macabre, have occasionally trespassed, their lenses capturing the decay. They film the collapsed roof of one shack, the discarded toys being reclaimed by ivy, the eerie silence that is broken only by the bark of a dog or, perhaps, the guttural sound of Ray's voice from within. These digital ghosts project their own narratives onto the scene, speaking in hushed, dramatic tones about the most inbred family in America. They rarely see the people, only the spectacle. They fail to capture the complexity, the moments where Betty gently leads her brother by the arm, or the simple ritual of sharing a meal on a splintered wooden bench. The family has become a backdrop for our collective fascination with the taboo, their reality flattened into a meme or a shocking thumbnail. And what of the younger generations? The children and grandchildren born from this tangled tree. Their fates are the next, style-enfolding chapter. Some, it is whispered, have managed to break free, moving to nearby towns, marrying outside the family, and deliberately fading into anonymity. They change their names, sever ties, and live with the ghost of their ancestry as a private, haunting shame. They are the lucky ones, perhaps, but they carry their own scars, the fear of genetic time bombs, the social stigma if their origins are discovered, the fractured identity of being from a place they had to escape. Others were not so fortunate. They remained in the orbit of the hollow, caught in the same gravitational pull of poverty and limited opportunity. For them, the cycles have proven harder to break. Court records from the last decade show a familiar pattern: petty crimes, substance abuse, and, most tragically, the continuation of abuse allegations. The same insularity that protected the family from the outside world also provided cover for predators within. A cousin, an uncle, a brother, the lines of relations so blurred that accountability became impossible to enforce within the clan. The community's old habit of looking away, of minding its own business, continues to enable this darkness. The local sheriff's department knows the address well. It is a recurring location in their logs, a problem they can never truly solve, only periodically contain. The land itself seems to hold the memory, the soil of odd, steeped in the blood and tears of generations. is a silent accomplice. The same steep, forested hills that provided a hiding place for the Whitakers' ancestors now trap their descendants. The beauty of the Appalachian spring, with its explosion of green, and the brutal isolation of its winters, have shaped this story as much as any human decision. It is a place of profound contradiction, where breathtaking vistas look down on profound human suffering. So, where does this leave us? The Whitaker story is not a closed case. It is a slow-moving tragedy, a living study in the consequences of neglect, both familial and societal. The question is no longer just, what happened to the Whitakers? But what does our continued fascination with them say about us? Do we look because we care, or because it makes our own lives seem more orderly by comparison? Their suffering has become a form of grim entertainment, a story we consume from the safety of our screens. The true horror is not the inbreeding itself, but the ecosystem that allowed it to persist and worsen over a century. It is the story of a forgotten America, where the social contract has frayed to nothing, where people are left to sink or swim in waters choked with the debris of poverty, poor education, and a lack of hope. The Whitakers are not monsters from a folktale. They are the human result of being left behind. The whispers in the hollow are growing fainter now, as the last of that generation passes on, but the silence that follows will be just as heavy, just as telling. It will be the silence of a question never properly answered. When will we stop watching the shadows, and finally have the courage to bring in the light? That silence is not an empty one. It is a presence, thick with the weight of unresolved history. It hangs over the hollow, long after the social worker sedans have retreated, and the YouTube influencers have packed their equipment, taking their curated horror back to the digital world. This silence is the true legacy, and it speaks in a language of its own. It speaks through the children of the children who got away. They are the second-hand survivors, living with a phantom limb of a past they never fully knew. Some reported deep-seated, inexplicable anxiety, a fear of closed-in places, or of their own biology. They might discover a minor health issue, a heart murmur, a unique skeletal formation, and their first thought is not of medicine, but of genealogy. They look in the mirror, searching for the telltale signs, the ghost of a fused eyelid, or the slight asymmetry that whispers of a bloodline kept too pure. For them, a simple family medical history form is a document of terror, a map leading to a landmine of recessive genes. Their escape was physical, but the psychological chains are forged from a metal that does not rust. The silence also speaks through the land. The Whitaker property now stands as a ruin in the making, a physical manifestation of a decaying bloodline. The shacks, surrendering to gravity and ivy, are being slowly digested by the forest. A child's rusted bicycle is half swallowed by the undergrowth. A cracked porcelain doll's head stares blankly from a windowsill. These are not artifacts of a haunting in the supernatural sense, but relics of a human tragedy. The land is reclaiming its own, erasing the structures, but it cannot erase the story. Locals, even the younger ones who never knew the family personally, will still point and say, "That's the Whitaker place," with a tone that mixes pity, fear, and a strange, possessive pride. The family has become a local landmark, a dark stain on the community's identity that is also, perversely, a point of macabre distinction. And what of the institutions that failed them? The silence in the county records office is deafening. The manila folders containing the Whitaker name are a study in bureaucratic inadequacy. They are filled with incident reports, not solutions, with diagnoses, not cures. The paper trail is a chronicle of a system making contact, but never making a difference. A judge's order for family counseling, a citation for improper sanitation, a temporary removal of a child that only led to their return to the same environment months later. These documents are a monument to a fundamental truth. It is nearly impossible to save people from themselves, especially when the problem is as deeply rooted as the oak trees on their own land. The system was designed for acute crises, not for a chronic. multi-generational illness of the soul. This leads us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Are the Whitakers a unique anomaly, or are they a stark, concentrated example of a much wider American sickness? They are the extreme, yes, but they exist on a spectrum. They are the ultimate expression of what happens when isolation, be it geographic, economic, or social, is allowed to fester unchecked. In countless other hollows and forgotten towns across the nation, less extreme but similarly tragic cycles play out. Cycles of poverty, educational deprivation, poor health, and substance abuse become their own form of inbreeding, not genetic, but societal, passing down a legacy of limited horizons and defeated expectations from parent to child. The Whitakers hold up a distorted funhouse mirror to this reality. Their physical and mental deformities are the visible, grotesque manifestation of a decay that is usually invisible, the decay of opportunity, of community support, of hope. We look at them and are rightfully horrified, but our horror allows us to distance ourselves. We are not like them, we think, and on the surface, we are not. But the forces that created them, neglect, indifference, and a willingness to look, are forces that persist in every corner of a nation, struggling with inequality and despair. The final, lingering image is not of a monster, but of Betty, an old woman now, her body bowed by a lifetime of carrying not just firewood and water, but the entire weight of her family's existence. Her face is a roadmap of this hardship. She is the paradox at the heart of the story, both a victim of this legacy and its fiercest guardian. She protected her siblings from a world she believed was cruel and judgmental. But in doing so, she also protected the very conditions that perpetuated their suffering. There is a profound, tragic love in that, a love that was as binding as any chain. The wind still carries whispers through the Appalachian hollow, but they are changing. The whispers of forgotten sins are slowly being replaced by the whispers of those who have heard the story and are left unsettled. The question is no longer what is wrong with them, but what is wrong with us, that we allowed this to happen. The Whitaker bloodline may be thinning, but the questions it forces us to ask are only growing thicker, denser, and more urgent. They are buried not in the West Virginia soil, but in the national conscience, waiting for a courage we have yet to prove we possess.